Good afternoon and welcome to the BIA's Wetlands webinar. And we are going to be talking about the wetlands issues here because, frankly, as fast as the federal government has been modifying rules that govern the waters of the United States, the state government has been backfilling it with regulations of their own. And clearly this has led to a lot of questions, a lot of confusion, but we have a good group of experts here today to work us through those areas. And I wanted to just quickly introduce our guest speakers today. We'll start with Vipu Joshi. He is a principal at DUDAC, and he has been helping clients deal with regulatory issues for the last 22 years. Also from DUDAC is Lori Menares. She has been with DUDAC and a professional for over 15 years, so she brings lots of experience working through the regulatory environment here in San Diego and elsewhere. And of course, we have our own Jim Whalen. And who doesn't know Jim Whalen? Jim Whalen is an institution around here in San Diego. He's also the vice chair of the San Diego Planning Commission and was former chair of our own city-county legislation committee. And we are very pleased to have all of them. And I will turn it over to Jim Whalen. Jim?
Thanks, Matt. You didn't embarrass me too much. Good afternoon, everybody. I think let's start a little bit with a little more background on Lori and Vipul. Lori used to work for the Corps of Engineers, and she provides a lot of inside information because the agency can sometimes be hard to figure your way through it, and we'll be very fortunate to hear from her. Vipul and I go back many years. He's one of my closest friends in the industry, and I've relied on him for so many years on so many projects, and we're all going to hear a lot of good information today. First of all, let's talk a little bit about how I got involved with this thing. As we put in the blurb for the webinar, both state and federal regulatory wetlands agencies have been moving forward over the last years now. The Army Corps of Engineers through the EPA just produced the Navigable Waters Protections Rule, which dramatically changed the jurisdiction of the Army Corps of Engineers throughout the country. There are particularities that apply to our world because of our desert environment. There's been a lot of litigation, and that all failed. And so about, now it's more than a month, the judge cleared the way for the rule to proceed. On the state side, as we all know, California never misses an opportunity to make sure that the environment is fully and completely protected, especially when it's confronted by outsider forces such as the federal government, we'll call it. And as a result of what the federal government did, they've tightened the regulations at the state end. How I personally got involved is, well, we do a lot of projects that require Army Corps of Engineers and water board permits. I don't want to neglect the role of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and their 1602 streambed alteration agreements. They're not what we're going to talk about today. They're just as important in their own way. And if anybody has any questions on the 1602 process, just get a hold of Matt and we'll follow up with that. But that's not going to be the topic today. We, in our firm, work closely with all of the resource agencies and often have to spend a lot of time on industry-wide issues. That's how we got involved with the State Water Board in January of this year, which seems like 400 years ago, but it was just January where we started to work at the state level to try and make the regulations being proposed at the state level workable for our unique environment here. What is our strategy? Again, through the BIA City County Committee, is to leverage the MSCP plans that we have here and approved in many cases and places to help reduce the effect of the new regulations on us. and Lori's going to touch on all this. One thing I want to make sure we get out there, on its face, the core regulations seem pretty good because they're getting rid of their jurisdiction over what normally are considered just drainages when the rain falls. But some of us need to be able to pursue Section 7 consultations through the federal government's ESA, Fish and Wildlife Service, Army Corps of Engineers process. And maybe Lori will touch on that, but if she doesn't, we could talk about it later. This is very important for people who do not have approved MSCP subarea plans, which covers cities of Santee and all the ones in the North County except for Carlsbad, and all of the North County unincorporated area, and all of the East County unincorporated area. So it's important we go through that. And I think with that, I'll stop and let the real experts proceed. And we look forward to having you enjoy this as much as we do presenting it. Thanks.
Just one thing though, Jim, we're going to hold our questions to the end. So we're going to hear the presentations. And if you have questions, please type them in the chat box, and we will get to all the questions after the presentations.
You made me remember two things. One is, in case there's any burning questions right this minute before we get started, let us know. But the second thing is, for people who think this only applies to land where you're doing raw land projects, such as the master plan communities, think twice. Just recently, there was an announcement about an urban stream in the middle of El Cajon that's subject to the Army Corps of Engineers jurisdiction. So even when you're doing infill, you need to care about this. I'll stop. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. My name is Lori Menares. As Matt mentioned, I've been with DUDEC. I'm a regulatory specialist. I've been with DUDEC for almost 6 years now, and prior to that, I was the North Branch Chief for the Corps of Engineers in San Francisco District, and prior to that, closer to where you all are, I worked out of that Carlsbad office for the Army Corps as a senior project manager. So I'm going to share my screen and bring up the presentation at this point. So I'm going to start out tackling the first subject of the Corps' kind of changed jurisdiction, the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, and then I'm going to turn it over to Vipul to talk about the state procedures. So first of all, just kind of an overview summary of the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. So the Corps and EPA finalized this rule, as Jim mentioned, just over a month ago, June 22nd, 2020. So it's all pretty new, and everybody, us on this side, and even the Corps of Engineers, they're all trying to figure out, how to get this implemented. So this is all pretty new stuff. But it repealed the 2015 Obama era Clean Water Rule. So anyone that's kind of followed this soap opera for, 20 plus years knows that jurisdiction changes continuously, and it's kind of just, it's our job to keep on top of this, but this is just the latest change. It is effective, and it outlines only 4 categories of waters that are considered waters of the US. And it also specifically excludes a number of additional features. And some of these used to be waters of the US. So that's kind of what Jim was referring to. It has pretty big implications for all of us out here in the West, more so than in some other areas, but it just means that we all need to adapt and kind of figure out our best approach for managing projects and getting them through the process. There are some updated definitions such as tributaries and adjacent, and it nullifies the old guidance that was out there. So if any of you have been working through significant nexus determinations, since 2008, those are gone. They thought it might be confusing to keep Rapanos and SWANK guidance. If any of those terms are familiar to you, those are former court cases. that were kind of guiding, other than when the actual regulation is changed, people were using these other guidance documents, and those are now nullified. So just to start out with the 4 categories that are considered waters of the US. So this rule is actually a change in the Code of Federal Regulations. So that's the citation up there at the top. It's a little bit dry, but it means something to the core because it's more than guidance. It's a change in their actual regulations. So that's it at the top, 33 CFR 328.3, and then A1 through 4. And these are kind of the terms that you'll hear people using, like an A1 water or an A3 water. And that's where that comes from, is from that, the regulations code. So these are the 4 up on the screen here. So first of all, it's things that have been considered Section 10 Rivers and Harbors Act waters, and traditional navigable waters are the A1. So that's things like the Pacific Ocean, and then very specific, like listed pieces of some other water bodies you might be familiar with. So the Corps has this list up on their website if you ever need to know, what is a Rivers and Harbors Act water, or what's considered where have they made standalone TNW determinations. So they list, for example, the San Dieguito River, but only up to the I-5 bridge. So that would be the portion that's considered navigable. The second category, the A2 waters, are tributaries, but these also have a specific definition, and they only include perennial and intermittent drainages. So specifically not ephemeral. That's where it becomes pretty important for all of us in San Diego and in the West in general, in the arid West. I pulled a couple examples, the San Diego River and Otay River, just to think about some of these larger systems, what might actually be considered intermittent. And you can also note that both of these at their bottom areas are also TNWs, similar to that San Dieguito River listed above. But for the most part, the larger parts are not necessarily, they can go intermittent. So these, and then this next category, the A3 lakes, pounds, and impoundments of jurisdictional waters, they are probably going to need a careful analysis when we're looking at things like what is an intermittent versus an ephemeral drainage. The A3 waters were a puzzle to me as I was putting this presentation together, actually, to try to think of some examples. I talked to Veepal, and we thought the Old Mission Dam along the San Diego River is an example of an A3 water. There may be others, but it's not actually super clear, because the requirements to be an impoundment for an A3 water would be you'd have to already be impounding a perennial or intermittent drainage. The downstream portion has to be intermittent or perennial to contribute to the TNW, and it has to spill in what they call a typical year. And it's hard to think of some examples. So my other example was actually from Northern California, which is Loch Lomond Reservoir, a dam along a creek called Newell Creek, where we know that does spill all the time. So that's kind of important to me in thinking. It was way easier for me to find an example in Northern California than in the San Diego area. So not that there won't be some, but they're not readily apparent to practitioners, even the Army Corps at this point. So it will take a little more analysis to get this figured out. The fourth category, adjacent wetlands, they have to be adjacent to these other categories of waters. So it's not enough to be, near an ephemeral drainage. You have to actually be near an intermittent or perennial drainage, and not just near, you have to actually touch it or pretty much have a hydrologic connection. You can't be separated by an artificial structure or that sort of thing and still count. So it will probably eliminate some categories. The hydrologic connection is important. There's a much longer list of excluded features, which I have up here on the screen. The rule does specify in it, so also in the regulations. So in B1 through 12, these are the 12 categories, many of which have long not been considered waters of the US, but more just kind of on case-by-case determinations. So a nod to a lot of these was already in the Corps' preamble to their 1986 regs. So that was what used to commonly be cited when you would say, oh, you know, an artificial lake or pond, but was never codified. I mean, interestingly, a lot of these were also exclusions under the Obama era rule, the 2015. But both of these rules have actually put these in the regs and just made it, you know, more cut and dry. But again, this does include ephemeral stream channels as being excluded by rule. And ditches are specifically excluded, with some caveats if they are relocating an intermittent or perennial water, or if they're within like a true adjacent, true according to this rule, wetland, those may still be brought back in. So again, it just kind of highlights we have to kind of take a closer look, or still take a close look when we're determining jurisdiction, especially kind of the intermittent versus ephemeral issue is going to be something they're kind of puzzling with over at the Corps right now, to use some definitions from other areas, kind of flow analyses. So I think more to come on that. And then I think important for this area is also that a lot of vernal pools may not be making that adjacency category for wetlands. So it's another consideration. So in terms of what this all means for our project options, in terms of process and kind of determining jurisdiction, so we still at this point have the approved JD or the preliminary JD options. So approved JDs would be what you would be getting to specifically exclude certain resources that you feel are not jurisdictional. So the ephemeral drainages or the vernal pools that do not seem to be adjacent wetlands. For a long time, so since really Rapanos and in recent practice codified or put into practice by the regulatory guidance letter 1601, you've had this option to do a preliminary jurisdictional determination in which you can just assume, for the most part, for purposes of processing your application through the Corps, that aquatic features on a site are jurisdictional. And a lot of people have chosen to do that just to either expedite their process, or because, as Vipul's going to describe, the Water Board has really taken on jurisdiction and mitigation requirements anyway, to the point where sometimes it just behooves a process to combine them all, or for the Section 7 reasons that Jim mentioned, where you want a core federal nexus so you can have a consultation. So at this point, the regulations are still retained at Part 331, and Regal 1601 is still applicable. So it's still an option. So it's at this point, you should just kind of weigh what's going to work for you and your project. And I've heard that there is some guidance pending on how they're going to implement all of this, at least in our region in South Pacific Division. But you know, at this point, you still have both options open. So what to expect moving forward? It's kind of the lawsuits and things that Jim alluded to. So far, they haven't gotten anywhere, so the rule is in effect. We do think that as much as the rule is trying to simplify things, it does make some of your choices a little complicated. So, you know, our advice is just to plan for multiple scenarios in case either jurisdiction changes or some of the guidance changes. Just be ready, you know, try to stay tuned to what's happening and go from there. It's not necessarily cut and dry, but you know, we'll just continue to track and try to give people options for what we think is the best way forward. With that, I will turn it over to Vipul, and I will forward slides for you, Vipul.
All right, great. Thanks, Lori. Thanks, Jim and Matt, for the introductions and for inviting us to present. So as has been alluded to, I'll be talking about the water board's wetland procedures, which were developed kind of in response to what has really been years of potential changes at the federal level. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So these new procedures became effective this year, and that really is a result of several years of work that the water board has been engaged in, starting with the technical advisory committee to look at, what are the threats to wetlands within the state and what sort of procedures should be in place to help the water board be more effective in its regulation. I think one of the main goals for the water board was to increase consistency from the different boards, because they are kind of all over the place in terms of how much mitigation is required, how much rigor the applications go through, depending on what region you're in. And so at a state level, they wanted to obviously provide some more consistency and clear expectations for the regulated community. Let's see. So prior to the procedures going into effect, there was a public review period, and I think there were some improvements made through that public process. A lot of it was through the efforts of the regulated community like the BIA, as well as a lot of municipal agencies and even the Army Corps commented on the procedures to try to help make sure that they were understandable and try to align. I think a lot of the comments were asking the water board to align their procedures with the federal and other state agencies. I think the end result is that the water board certainly got what they wanted in terms of, there's kind of no surprise there in terms of they were able to clearly establish a broader definitions and a broad definition for what they can regulate. They established quite a few additional procedures that I'll be going through that are part of the application process now for everybody, whereas in the past, I think they were kind of an ad hoc part of the permitting process, especially in coastal regions like San Francisco, San Diego, and LA, but now they're in place across the board. But where the regulated community, I think, got was able to insert in there were some efficiencies and exemptions, some acknowledgement, like Jim mentioned, of planning documents that should help applicants navigate the process. There is kind of under number 2 there is another factor kind of in play. So the EPA, kind of similar to the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, has another rule that they've published. It's the 401 certification rule. So that's gone through the draft process, the public comment, and now the final rule is out. There's a kind of a waiting period before it becomes effective. So the effective date is September 11th of this year. So we're kind of in that place where lawsuits have been filed. California has joined with I think about a dozen other states and filed a lawsuit to stop this rule going into effect. Because what it would do is essentially narrow what the water board can do under 401. And it's a more strict interpretation in which EPA is saying water boards, you really can only make comments on water quality issues. You can't talk about wetlands mitigation or other factors. It really needs to stick to just water quality, and it also imposes some more strict timing requirements. So we're in a wait and see approach, or wait and see time in terms of whether that goes into effect and what exact effect it has. But I'll talk about kind of what we predict to happen if that does go into effect. In terms of the key changes from the procedures, this is what I'll be focusing on. I mentioned the broader wetland definition, and then additional requirements kind of as part of the permit process. You can go to the next slide. So first, just a quick overview of why, when does the Water Board get involved? So Section 401 of the Clean Water Act says that when the Army Corps is considering a permit under the Clean Water Act, there needs to be a certification by the state agency, or if you're in a tribal area, by the tribes, with regards to water quality. So does that, will that permit comply with local water quality standards? And those, permits, that is a requirement of 401. So you have to, requirement of the Clean Water Act. So in order to get your 404 permit, you have to satisfy 401. But there are time limits to that. So typically it's 60 days from having a complete application. The board is required to either certify or deny your application. However, in practice, that often takes quite a bit longer. And that's one of the things that the EPA rule would seek to limit. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So the state also has kind of additional authorities besides the Clean Water Act. There's what's called the State Porter Cologne Act. And under that act, any discharge to a waters of the state requires a waste discharge requirement. Kind of an odd term for a permit, but it's called the WDR. And currently, those are mainly used when you're dealing with impacts to wetlands or waters that are outside of federal jurisdiction. But I think this is an area where, at the state level, if the federal jurisdiction becomes narrower, fewer resources under federal jurisdiction, or if the state's authorities under 401 are limited, what we'll probably see is the state assert more authority through the WDR. And one key aspect of the WDR is that there are a few general WDRs that are already kind of like nationwide permits. They're already sort of pre-certified at the state level. But if you don't meet one of those qualifications, you're doing an individual WDR, which need to be approved by the board at a public hearing. And also important to note that the procedures that I'm talking about apply to both 401 and WDR. So these are going to likely be in place regardless of any changes at the federal level with regards to 401. Okay, next slide. So the wetland definition. The first change is in general, they definitely refer to the federal definitions and federal standards for conducting wetland delineation. They didn't create any new manuals for how to do the field work and how to identify wetlands. So we would use the same procedures. It's just that there were some minor changes in terms of how you interpret that data. So at the state level, they decided that wetlands do not need to be vegetated. At the federal level, you need to have all three criteria. It's vegetation, soils, and hydrology. At the state level, there are some cases where you can have an unvegetated wetland. Those are mostly like salt flats or mud flats, things like that. They don't come into play too often. But the key change was that they refer to both current and historic federal definitions as defining state wetlands. So what this does is kind of reach back into, prior to the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, any wetlands that were identified under previous core standards would be considered state wetlands. So again, ephemeral stream channels are not generally considered wetlands. Those are waters, and it's important to note that while the state identified a definition for wetlands, they didn't change their definition for what's a state waters. So that is still a very broad definition. It literally says any waters that are within the state, both groundwater, tidal waters, any place where essentially water collects or falls. They can call that out as a waters of the state and regulate it. But their purpose in identifying wetlands, both under the current and historic federal definition, is to take kind of provide added protection to any areas that meet those wetland criteria like vegetation or soils. So an important example here are vernal pools. Vernal pools often do meet the wetland criteria, but they have, even prior to the new federal rule, there were, in many cases, considered isolated wetlands and not under federal jurisdiction. But just by virtue of the fact that they're wetlands, they will meet the state definition and then come with those requirements for mitigation and avoidance and minimization. You can go to the next slide. So just some broad examples of what are wetlands. The procedures talk about natural wetlands. That's pretty straightforward, things that are naturally occurring and haven't been modified. The second category are modifications of surface waters of the state. So again, if something, we deal with this a lot with stormwater channels. If they're built to convey stormwater, they were often built in a location where a previous waters of the state occurred. Those are still regulated as wetlands. And then the third category are artificial wetlands. So this is going to require quite a bit of evaluation to determine. There are a number of criteria listed in the procedures as to when an artificial wetland can be regulated or not. It's in general, if that artificial wetland, even if it's essentially, so you can kind of think of a stormwater BMP on a development site. That's, it's an upland area, you're diverting the water through there, so there was no wetland there before, but you've created a wetland by diverting your runoff. You're often required to divert your runoff to a detention basin or something like that. In general, what the procedures say, as long as that stays in current use and is maintained, it will be considered an artificial wetland and will not be regulated. However, as many of you probably know and have experienced, what is considered currently maintained and serviceable can often be a point of contention when properties change hands or areas are left to become naturalized. There is a risk that those would then kind of get captured into the regulatory process, and the procedures explicitly kind of allow for those naturalized wetlands to be regulated. There's also a 1 acre requirement for those artificial wetlands, so they are trying to kind of limit that to larger wetlands. So if you do have an artificial wetland that's over 1 acre and you're not keeping it maintained, those are likely to be captured in the state regulation. Okay, next slide. So now I'm going to get into some of the kind of procedures or the, what's going to happen once you submit your application. One of the largest requirements or biggest changes was this requirement for an alternatives analysis. Again, this was previously kind of done on an ad hoc basis. But now will be required for nearly all projects. There are kind of a list of exemptions you can see here, but they are very limited, and the size requirements are generally around 0.2 of an acre and 300 linear feet. If you're under that and you meet certain requirements, you may be able to be exempted from the alternatives analysis. There is this provision, kind of third one listed here for projects that are conducted in accordance with the watershed plan. We're waiting to see kind of how that is interpreted. Our hope is that the MSCP and other planning documents that we have will be interpreted as acceptable watershed plans, and that development, if you're working in an area that's been identified for development, that you would be exempted from the alternatives analysis. But a lot of this is really going to be subject to regulators' interpretation, and we just certainly do anticipate that most projects will have to go through an alternatives analysis. And there's a three-tiered system in the procedures for how detailed that alternatives analysis has to be. So the more impacts you have, the more detailed your alternatives analysis has to be. And it's important to note that that if you're at the highest tier, which is not too difficult to get to for a lot of projects based on the size thresholds that they have established, that requires both on-site and off-site alternatives. So you typically, when we prepare an application, we'll start by looking at your CEQA document and your alternatives analysis in there. But as you know, for CEQA, we don't often look at off-site alternatives, and we think that will definitely require some additional work when preparing your application. The next slide is on mitigation. So here, the state did make an effort to incorporate the Corps' mitigation rule from back in 2008. The Corps established pretty clear guidance or rule, I guess, a regulatory rule on what is required for compensatory mitigation. The state adopted most of those same factors, but there are a couple of nuances. For one, they really emphasize the watershed approach, and I think in practice, we haven't at the federal level, while that's referenced in the federal regulations and the federal rule, we haven't seen the federal agencies really push that your mitigation site fit really well within a watershed. Whereas I think at the state level, it gives them kind of more reason to deny your mitigation or say it's not in an appropriate location within the watershed. And so I think that's going to be a factor that's going to kind of make it difficult to permit, maybe your first mitigation site or your first mitigation proposal out of the box. The water boards have traditionally, really emphasized in watershed mitigation, often on site, whereas at the federal level, there's sort of more of an emphasis on mitigation banks and in lieu fee programs. So we think that's still going to be a point of contention, point of discussion between the agencies. And then at the state level, there is a requirement for a minimum 1-to-1 ratio for all projects. That's not stated in the federal regulations. There's also not, at the federal level, well, at least within our region, there is a mitigation calculator, if you will, for identifying what your mitigation ratio is. That was not adopted at the state. So they still have a lot of the same factors, but I think the state definitely has retained their authority to, and they often use this, they often will require higher mitigation ratios than the federal agencies. So with that, I think, and go to the next slide, I think Lori and I are going to go through a quick example to hopefully make this maybe a little bit more clear, and then we'll open it up for questions. So we just kind of created a hypothetical example that we see pretty typically in the San Diego region. So this is a residential development. We identified impacts to ephemeral streams, about 1/3 of an acre, 3,000 linear feet. So those are, very typical 1/3 of an acre. You just need like 3 or 4 foot wide streams coming off of a hillside to kind of, get to that number, 3,000 linear feet. Often those channels go through coastal sage scrub habitat that'll have gnatcatcher. They may be drained down to a wetland area that you are planning on preserving and maybe doing your mitigation in that wetland area. And then like Jim mentioned, if you're in most of North County or in East County, you may not have an approved local habitat conservation plan. So you basically have no take for that gnatcatcher. So yeah, on the next slide, we'll kind of talk about what you would do in that situation.
Did you want me to? Yeah, I can do
Yeah, I
the
think you were
kind of
going to
first
start.
portion. Yeah. So typically we do recommend going forward with a pre-application meeting. I think people and I thought that's particularly important at this stage, just to make sure with all these changing regulations and guidance that you have a plan and you're kind of presenting it to the agencies and getting early feedback on things like jurisdiction and the Section 7, et cetera. And then you'd submit your applications. And in this example, we were thinking you would submit it with your aquatic resources delineation report, your BA, and a PJD request. So that's kind of assuming that that's what will work best in terms of being able to get Section 7 consultation, because as people mentioned, we did an example where there isn't HCP coverage under the MSCP or something like that. Another habitat conservation plan. So you would need the Corps as your federal nexus under Section 7 to avoid doing an individual HCP. The one kind of nuance here is if things do change at some point and or you for some reason want to have your narrow core jurisdiction because there are ephemeral drainages, there may be another option through this bifurcated Section 7 consultation process. There's guidance that's released, agreements between the Corps and Fish and Wildlife Service at a national level to do this like bifurcated approach for what they call projects that have a small federal handle. So when the Corps scope of analysis is limited, you might still have the option of the service expanding the scope of their consultation over the larger project. But not many of these have gone through yet. And talking with Jim yesterday, he's indicated it's still a pretty early process for the service. So just wanted to mention that there are some other options to look into for that. But for this example, we wanted to assume more of a kind of traditional Section 7 process.
Yeah, and then in terms of the water board, you now have this alternatives analysis requirement, and your mitigation must kind of conform with the watershed approach. So again, like I mentioned, for the alternatives analysis, there's a high likelihood that, while you may start with your alternatives in your EIR, those are often, based kind of on a land planning standpoint in terms of density. What you'll need to develop is kind of more specific alternatives related to those waters. So can you do less grading over those ephemeral stream channels? How can you modify that development? And this is a project that would require offsite alternatives. So what other land is available for development, and how can these homes that you're building be provided in an alternative location? So again, we don't know how hard the agencies are going to push, how many alternatives they're going to require, or whether they're going to reject what you propose. So again, meeting with them early, identifying what information you have and what you plan on presenting will be really important. And then with regards to mitigation, like I said, often we want to do on-site mitigation. And traditionally, that's what the regional board has preferred, because it's obviously in the same watershed and it's close to the impact, and you own the property already. So it's great from that perspective. However, the new procedures really require the board to look at how does that mitigation site fit within the watershed. So it may not be the most suitable location in the watershed if you have invasive species that are upstream. And that could put you in a bit of a bind where the regional board is saying we can't approve your mitigation site because it doesn't conform with the watershed plan, and now you're having to look at potentially purchasing offsite to get your mitigation done. It would be ideal if we had mitigation banks in all the watersheds, but we of course have very few mitigation banks in San Diego County, so it makes it quite difficult. But you would, obviously work through those items and try to get to a permit decision. So I think that's it. We can go to the next slide, and we just have some final takeaways before we get into questions.
Yeah, I think our first takeaway from all of this, as we mentioned in the previous slide, having your pre-application consultation, really get started with your agency engagement early, maybe even prior to public review of your CEQA document, just because it is pretty complex at the moment. And then you have to make sure that your submittals are thorough and accurate. So make sure you have a really reputable firm helping you complete all of your documentation, make sure it's scientifically sound and that your design is sound as well.
Yeah, and I think it just becomes more important since these are new regulations. It's really important to establish lines of communication with the agency management. All the agency staff people are trying to, learn their way through this, and what we've seen already is that we get kind of a lot of confusing direction. They may ask for something one day, you work on providing it, and when it comes in, they realize that they want something else, or they didn't quite. Just things change, and so if you can engage with staff's management from the beginning, make sure they're CC'd on emails. That really helps when you're 6 months down the line, you haven't made any progress, and you're appealing to management to, how do we get to the end of the tunnel on this permit process? And I think you can, from my understanding, you can really leverage kind of the regulatory affairs portion of BIA, kind of maintains regular engagement with the management at these agencies. So I think, communicating within BIA as to what your experience has been is really important. And these regulators, while they seem like they're maybe not accountable to anybody, ultimately, if we do are facing issues, we have been involved with appeals to congressional delegations and state state legislators that can start to help move things. So overall, definitely be prepared for kind of additional costs and schedule delays. I think our typical permits now, it's pretty hard to get a permit in 12 months. We can still do that, but kind of 18 months is more typical to get through the permit process for even a pretty simple project, honestly.
If you're lucky.
Yeah.
Let's keep it optimistic.
All right. Are we ready for questions?
Yes, we are ready for questions. I will say, as the presentations went forward, we're getting questions in the chat room, and your presentations were so thorough. A lot of them were answered just during your presentation. Let's see what we have. We do have one from an anonymous attendee. As I recall, there is a San Diego County map which identifies the U.S. waters. It sounds like the feds were looking to limit the jurisdiction over drainage, intermittent streams, etc. While there will be a new map showing which waters are no longer under the new rule. Are you familiar with this map that they're talking about?
You mean USGS maps?
It looks like, yeah.
Yeah, there are a number of resources. So, you probably heard of blue line streams. Those refer to the USGS maps that show, drainages, main drainages. There's also a national wetlands inventory that identifies wetlands and drainages. There's never been there isn't a definitive map of where core jurisdiction is, and there won't be going forward. So there are a bunch of resources to identify what might be a jurisdictional resource, but especially with this new rule, even if you have a blue line stream, it's going to take some analysis of what, whether that would qualify under the new rule.
And then I think I mentioned in my presentation, the Corps on their website does publish their list of Section 10 Rivers and Harbors Act water limits, and then also where standalone traditional navigable waters jurisdiction determinations have been made, because some of those were standalone since that's kind of in the post-Rapanos era, but they do have both of those listed on their website, and those would give you a clue as to where to start for where you're determining when something is a tributary to a TNW, you know, you at least have a start for what TNW you're talking about. So that list still exists.
One thing I was going to mention, Matt, is there are 4 other questions that I just said we would answer them live. So they're not quite answered yet. I can go through them real quick.
Sure, go right ahead.
The first one is it possible to get the presentation that's sent to the participants of today's webinar so that they didn't have to frantically take notes? I assume we can do that. Yes? Yes,
we can definitely make it available.
Yes. All right, we'll get it out. We will get it out to everyone, yes.
Okay, and here's some other ones. To clarify, if a project already assumes an ephemeral drainage, it's a state and federal water, then can the process continue as jurisdictional? I will take a shot at that one. Today it can. It's possible that the guidance document for that decision-making process will change, but today it can. And we're going to be working with the Corps to make sure that today's processes that are good stay good. Here's another one. What happens if you have a completed project with a larger wetland and it becomes regulated by the state due to a perception or reality of non-maintenance and it becomes more natural? Does it still count as a water quality feature for the purposes of cleaning the project runoff? What are the other implications? That actually is a great question because it brings us to the alternative compliance question. One of the things the BIA has been working very closely on is to have alternative methods of complying with the mitigation requirements where you combine both stormwater treatment and habitat conservation features. The BIA Stormwater Task Force has been working on that for years now, and we have some clarity that the Water Board here does want to do them, but they're case by case for now because the local jurisdictions have not adopted their own policies. But the concern you have about a feature becoming more natural, you should be able to translate that into a benefit rather than a negative. Let's let people do this one. Restoration is the preferred method. How is this different from the past Regional Water Quality Control Board position?
Yeah, it's not very different. So I think the regional board has always emphasized restoration as opposed to preservation or enhancement. You know, that helps them achieve no net loss of wetlands. So that's still going to be the case. And I think that one-to-one minimum requirement needs to be fulfilled by some type of restoration, whether it's reestablishment or establishment of a new site. It's really, you know, I think the key difference is, you know, where is the location of that mitigation site? A little bit more emphasis or latitude, I think, for the agencies to comment on the location of your mitigation.
Okay, we have 2 more, and then I had a comment. It's my understanding that the Corps has limited funding and certain applications may not be processed until funding is available. Any way to remedy this situation? Laura, you want to grab that one?
Yeah, there aren't too many remedies. There is an option under the WRDA 214 agreements where if you're a, non-federal public entity, you can actually pay for a position over at the Corps. So they'll be careful to say you're not buying their permit decision, but you are buying project management time. Not always applicable for, you know, private industry, but sometimes you can also take advantage of other public entities that develop things like habitat conservation plans or other, you know, regional general permits programs with the Corps. So that those are kind of the only options in terms of providing some level of funding to help with that.
It's pretty bad. Here's another one. What about the various lagoons in North County, Bataquitas, Buena Vista, et cetera? How are they categorized by the state and the feds? Well, I'll do the state. Yes, they're jurisdictional. I would argue that they're probably jurisdictional at the federal level too, if they access to the ocean. Do you think so, Lori?
Yeah, several of the North County lagoons are listed on that list of TNWs and or Rivers and Harbors Act waters. So most of those are A1 waters.
Okay, here's some more. So Matt, I think you got interest in this topic. We might want to do a follow-up in 6 months or so. Here's one. Was there any change to the 10A process to include finite response times? Somebody is a joker. That'll never happen. I like a sense of humor in this kind of world, but when pigs fly, there will be accountability on schedule for our regulatory agencies. That's a good one. And I don't mean to be glib. Yeah, I do, actually.
Yeah, you are. Yes, you absolutely want to be glib.
Here's another one. And actually, Lori touched on it, and we do it all the time. We've had to go to Washington, D.C. more than once to get problems solved with the Fish and Wildlife Service, with CORE. We've had to go to the House Armed Services Committee to get language changed. And you should just expect, in some cases, you're going to get into a back and forth battle. Here's another one. For the example project, it was implied that a 404 permit was sought despite the fact that the project was only impacting ephemeral drainages, which are now excluded from the waters of the U.S. Would you please clarify this? That's for people or Lori.
Yeah, so I think in our example, because there was no Section 10 coverage for the gnatcatcher, we were kind of assuming that you would want to do a 404 permit in order to get the Section 7 coverage for your take of gnatcatcher. The alternative, and we didn't really talk about this in too much detail, but if you don't have any 404 waters permit, you're not going to try to get a 404 permit. You're still going to require a state permit, so waste discharge requirement in that case. Which is a little bit more onerous than getting a 401 certification because you have to get scheduled for a board hearing. And then for any endangered species, obviously you have no federal nexus, so now you're subject to Section 10, which, like Jim mentioned, there's no time constraint on that, and it's can be quite onerous.
Okay. We just got another one. Says, thank you so much. Please schedule a follow-up presentation. So I think we should do that. A couple other things that we didn't talk about in too much detail, and I don't think we have more than 5 minutes left, right, Matt?
We have like 1 minute left.
Okay, fine, really fast. We, through the BIA Stormwater Task Force, have been meeting regularly with the Water Board because in this document here, which says implementation guidance, we don't have our exceptions for the alternatives analysis. Who would have thought that they would have forgotten to put in our exception?
Go
when
figure.
we talk to them. Yeah, go figure. So we're working those things through. Some of the good things that we could get is out of kind, out of watershed mitigation. We no longer have to do lineal feet. We used to have to do fake drainages that went back and forth across a hill. You can now convert that into acreage. So there are some positives. We don't mean to be terrible doomsayers because actually, you know, it's what we do for a living. So we're successful at it. Just want to make sure everybody knows that this is a new world and we're going to have to work our way through it. And we really appreciate everybody's attention. Thank you.
Yes, we do. And I want to say thank you to Vipul, Lori, and Jim for your valuable time and some great information. And also to everyone who logged in to get the latest on the wetlands situation. Please let us know at the association what you thought about the webinar. And if there's any other follow-up questions, we can see if we can get some answered. I want to thank everyone very much again and hope you all have a terrific afternoon. Thank you for joining us today.
Bye.
Bye,
All right,
everyone.
thanks.
Bye.
And away we go.